Selamat siang ya, sudah siang ternyata. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Kami ucapkan selamat datang kepada yang terhormat Dekan dan Wakil Dekan Fakultas Ilmu Budaya, kepada yang terhormat Bapak Greg Poulgrain, Bapak Pradipto Niwandhono, Bapak Ibu Dekan Fakultas Ilmu Budaya. Selamat datang juga kepada perwakilan dari Development Study Club serta hadirin sekalian. Pertama-tama marilah kita panjatkan puji syukur atas kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala yang telah melimpahkan rahmat dan hidayahnya sehingga pada siang hari ini kita dapat mengikuti kegiatan diskusi publik dalam keadaan sehat walafiat. Salawat serta salam marilah tetap kita panjatkan kepada junjungan kita Nabi besar Muhammad SAW. Bapak Ibu sekalian, sebelum memasuki acara inti, perkenankan saya untuk membacakan susunan acara pada siang hari ini. Acara yang pertama adalah pembukaan, dilanjutkan dengan sambutan, dilanjutkan dengan diskusi publik, dan ditutup dengan sesi tanya jawab dan foto bersama. Memasuki acara selanjutnya yakni pembukaan, menyanyikan lagu Indonesia Raya dan himne Airlangga. Untuk itu hadirin kami mohon untuk berdiri.
Jadi padu
persilahkan untuk duduk kembali. Acara selanjutnya adalah sambutan. Yang pertama adalah sambutan dari Fakultas Ilmu Budaya yang akan disampaikan oleh Wakil Dekan 3 Fakultas Ilmu Budaya. Untuk itu kepada Ibu Lina Puryanti kami persilakan untuk memberi sambutan sekaligus membuka acara.
Terima kasih Mbak Dahlia. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Pertama-tama mari kita panjatkan segala rasa syukur kita kepada Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala karena pada siang hari ini kita dipertemukan dalam sebuah forum yang saya kira sangat penting bagi kita untuk memahami satu perspektif tentang konfrontasi yang sebenarnya menurut saya sangat penting ya dalam membangun fondasi our nation state building kita, tapi mungkin tidak banyak yang memberikan perhatian ke sana. Dan untuk itu I appreciate Prof. Poulgrain yang bersedia untuk berbagi dengan kami semua pada siang hari ini. Kawan-kawan semua, saya kira pertemuan hari ini sangat penting ya untuk kita semua. I would like to inform you, Pak Greg, that students who are joining us today are coming from the class of Introduction to Indonesian History, and then also from the Southeast Asian. So, of course, your perspective will be very important for the students to understand one period in period in our history, especially if we then connect with the, I'm sure that you are para mahasiswa cukup familiar dengan misalnya Cold War ya, dengan perang dingin, isu perang dingin dan sebagainya, bagaimana itu juga membentuk apa yang kita sebut sebagai Southeast Asia. Jadi kita tidak boleh mulai hari ini dan seterusnya tidak boleh hanya memandang region ya, wilayah Southeast Asia itu sebagai negara yang terletak di south-nya south of, kalau Southeast Asia berarti south-nya dari mana? China or India? East-nya dari mana? China or India? Itu harus paham ya, that's kind of a basic concept ketika kita memahami tentang region. Tapi kita harus melihat bahwa region ini juga terbentuk dari berbagai peristiwa-peristiwa sejarah ya, dan bagi saya ini menjadi sebuah kuliah yang penting. Jadi kawan-kawan semua, fakultas berusaha untuk mengekspos Anda semaksimal mungkin kepada para para akademisi ya, akademisi kelas dunia yang akan memberikan Anda sebuah perspektif yang sangat kaya. And thank you so much for Pak Profesor Greg Poulgrain. Senang sekali bisa bertemu dengan Bapak hari ini. Pak Greg berbahasa Indonesia? Sedikit-sedikit, oke. Belum lancar, oke. But of course, the students also learn. Yeah, I mean that it is also very important for the students that they are exposed maximally to the international scholars. Because if we are only thinking from the local perspective, we will lose the connection between our locality with what happened on the level of a global. Okay? So officially dengan resmi, nggak pakai resmi-resmi sebenarnya ya, udah pokoknya diskusi kita mulai. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih kami sampaikan kepada Ibu Lina. Sambutan selanjutnya dari perwakilan Development Study Club. Untuk itu,
oh ya, sorry tadi belum thank you sama Mas Reza dan Mas Azir who initiated. Thank you so much. Oke.
Baik, untuk itu kami mengundang Bapak Azir untuk memberikan sambutan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih untuk hadirin yang hadir pada kali ini. Terima kasih untuk Fakultas Ilmu Budaya yang berkenan mewadahi acara diskusi di ASEEC kali ini bersama Poulgrain. 2014 pernah saya mendengar ada berita terkait pergantian nama Indonesia menjadi Nusantara yang diwacanakan oleh Pak Akan Budaya. Mungkin itu serius atau enggak, saya nggak tahu. Tapi di situ banyak berita muncul dengan membandingkan beberapa negara yang pernah mengganti namanya. Salah satunya adalah Malaya menjadi Malaysia. Di situ mungkin pada waktu itu saya anggap Malaysia dan Malaya itu sama. Tapi ternyata itu sangat berbeda ketika saya membaca buku dari Pak Poulgrain bahwa Federasi Malaysia adalah bentukan dari Federasi Malaya yang ada di Semenanjung Malaya ditambah dengan Sarawak dan North Borneo, British North Borneo yang jadi Sabah, dan juga Singapura yang nantinya juga keluar dari Federasi Malaysia tahun 65. Jika membaca tulisan dari pasangan Andaya berjudul History of Malaysia, Indonesia masuk dalam pusara konflik konfrontasi itu bulan Desember tahun 62 setelah adanya peristiwa di Brunei yang dipimpin oleh Azhari. Yang waktu itu menjadi Perdana Menteri. Konfrontasi di Indonesia terhadap Malaysia diumumkan bulan Januari tahun 63 oleh Dr. Subandrio. Sedangkan untuk Soekarno sendiri mengambil sikap pada tanggal 27 Juli 63 dengan pidato ganyang Malaysianya yang terkenal di hadapan Front Nasional. Untuk negara Malaysia itu baru tanggal 16 September 63. Dan konfrontasi diakhiri oleh Soekarno sendiri dengan menandatangani Undang-Undang Republik Indonesia Nomor 5 tahun 66 dengan judul persetujuan untuk menormalisasi hubungan antara Republik Indonesia dan Malaysia. Melihat runtutan waktu yang tersebut, jelas tentunya banyak peristiwa-peristiwa yang nantinya akan dijelaskan oleh Pak Poulgrain yang meneliti terkait konfrontasi Indonesia dan Malaysia yang dianggap Soekarno sebagai negara boneka Nekolim, dan banyak sekali intrik politik dari Alan Dulles dan banyak sekali orang yang terlibat di dalamnya. Oleh karena itu, judul diskusi kali ini kami sepakati dengan Melawan Nekolim dengan Konfrontasi, mengutip pengantar yang ditulis oleh Pradipto Niwandhono di dalam buku Genesis Konfrontasi edisi bahasa Inggris. Lenyapnya konfrontasi dalam hubungan sejarah Indonesia modern setelah meletusnya yang dinamai G30S. Konfrontasi yang umumnya diingat hanya jargon Soekarno tentang ganyang Malaysia, tetapi peristiwa yang melatar belakangi jargon tersebut sangat jarang diketahui secara keseluruhan. Mungkin satu pertanyaan untuk Pak Greg, kenapa Brunei tidak masuk dalam Federasi Malaysia padahal juga terlibat dalam peristiwa konfrontasi itu? Terima kasih kepada Fakultas Ilmu Budaya yang telah berkenan mewadahi diskusi offline pertama di ASEEC kali ini. Semoga bisa bekerja sama selanjutnya, karena 2 tahun di ASEEC melakukan diskusi selalu online dan kali ini baru offline. Untuk kawan-kawan yang belum tahu, di ASEEC bisa membuka Instagram di ASEEC Development Study Club. Di situ kami kabarkan acara-acara diskusi kami setiap bulannya. Terima kasih untuk Pak Poulgrain yang juga berkenan datang ke Surabaya membagi hasil penelitiannya. Semoga diseminasi ilmu ini memantik kita semua melanjutkan penelitian-penelitian yang sudah ada, menjadi pengingat kita bahwa pernah ada politik luar negeri Indonesia yang menggerakkan tatanan dunia internasional maupun dalam negeri. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum. Salam kami dari ASEEC.
Terima kasih Bapak Azir atas sambutannya. Baik, acara selanjutnya adalah acara inti kita pada siang hari ini, yakni diskusi publik dengan topik Melawan Nekolim dengan Konfrontasi. Konfrontasi ya, sebenarnya konfrontasi. Baik. Untuk itu, acara diskusi publik pada siang hari ini akan dipimpin oleh moderator Bapak Reza M. Hikam. Monggo Bapak Reza.
Ya, terima kasih atas waktunya menjadi moderator. Kebetulan saya kayaknya diminta untuk mengundang pembicara untuk Mr. Poulgrain ini dan Pak Pradipto Niwandhono. Ya, saya izin memulai diskusi dengan duduk ya kawan-kawan ya. Agak capek soalnya. Oke. Nah, alhamdulillah kawan-kawan hari ini hadir. Ini dengar nggak suaraku kalau bicara gini? Nah, oke. Langsung pakai mic ya.
Pakai mic aja biar
pakai mic aja.
Usaha.
Nah, oke. Hari ini kawan-kawan di sini datang berdiskusi tentang konfrontasi. Ingat ya, ini diskusi ya. Jadi harapannya kawan-kawan jangan diam saja. Nah, nanti pasti ada pemateri dari Mr. Greg dan Pak Pradipto. Sedikit tentang konfrontasi tadi. Saya berterima kasih kepada teman saya Mas Azir ya. Jadi saya nggak perlu menjelaskan lagi karena sudah dijelaskan secara runtut. Jadi di sini saya hanya perlu memperkenalkan siapa sih pematerinya. Yang pertama di situ mungkin ada fotonya Pak Pradipto ya, yang pasti tidak asing buat kawan-kawan karena dosen ilmu sejarah yang baru saja lulus dari University of Sydney, yang disertasinya itu cukup menarik, terutama buat anak-anak yang awal-awal baru masuk kuliah itu kan seneng Marxis dan lain-lain ya, sosialisme, kodem, biasanya duduk di belakang itu ya, rambutnya panjang, anak-anak kiri, nah, ini cocok gitu. Bisa berdiskusi dengan pemikiran seperti itu tentang PSI bersama Pak Pradipto. Selain itu Pak Pradipto juga pernah menerbitkan buku tentang Indis ya. Nah, yang dilupakan itu bisa dibeli, buka aja Tokopedia dan Shopee, banyak kan. Nah, bisa cari diskonan juga di situ, pengen yang murah. Nah, selain itu selain Pak Pradipto ada Mr. Poulgrain. Nah, ini kebetulan sekali Pak Greg ini, kalau kawan-kawan yang concern terhadap sejarah luar negeri pasti pernah mendengar nama Baskara Tulus Wardayan. Ya, Romo Baskara waktu itu mengadakan diskusi dengan Prof. Greg Poulgrain ini, dan saya diundang. Nah, saya bertanya-tanya siapa Pak Greg ini. Saya cari, wah dapat bukunya. Tapi untung Mas Azir yang belikan saya buku, jadi saya nggak perlu keluar uang ya. Nah di situ saya belajar perlahan. Oh ternyata hubungan luar negeri Indonesia itu lebih daripada sekedar dagang sama Amerika, tidak sekedar ya, memang ada keterlibatan CIA ya. Cuman kan kalau orang Indonesia biasanya fokusnya ke konspirasi. Wah ini pasti CIA, ini ada CIA. Diskusi tentang hubungan Indonesia Amerika terus wifi-nya menteri-menteri, wah ini disadap CIA. Nah, pada data yang kuat. Nah inilah perbedaan. Nah ini yang menarik. Inilah perbedaan saat kita melihat atau membaca buku dari Pak Greg Poulgrain. Apa saja sih bukunya Pak Greg itu? Semua dalam fokus yang sama, yakni hubungan antara Indonesia dan Amerika. Kajian pertamanya adalah The Incubus of Intervention, yang sudah diterjemahkan ke dalam bahasa Indonesia, bayang-bayang intervensi. Terus ada The Genesis of Konfrontasi. Nah ini yang akan kita diskusikan pada hari ini. Dan yang ketiga adalah JFK versus Allen Dulles. Nah, tiga buku ini berfokus kepada satu hal. Siapa? Kennedy. Who is Kennedy? Ya pasti harusnya kawan-kawan tahu ya Kennedy ya. Nah, salah satu presiden yang tertembak di Amerika. Tapi ada info-info menarik nanti yang bakal diberitahu oleh Pak Greg ya. Yang pastinya bukan konspirasi ya. Itu yang paling penting. Nah, di sini nanti kita akan membedah lebih dalam what is konfrontasi. Itu salah satu kebijakan luar negeri Amerika yang judulnya bagus ya, konfrontasi. Jadi bukan bebas aktif. Kalau bebas aktif kan kita bingung. Udah bebas, terus aktif ini gimana? Kalau konfrontasi jelas, geger, ganyang Malaysia. Kalau Soekarno kan, Amerika kita setrika, Inggris kita linggis. Jadi tetap kita butuh dana bantuan. Endingnya dibuka kan. Itulah. Mungkin sekian ya dari saya yang, mohon maaf kalau sedikit guyonan. Biar ice breaking, tegang-tegang. Oke. Mungkin untuk pembahasan pertama saya berikan kepada Pak Greg Poulgrain.
Enggak, udah pakai itu, enggak pakai ini.
Oh ya.
So, thank you for being here today. We'll talk about Malaysian confrontation, Konfrontasi, our topic. Now, we know how it ended. 65, 66, Suharto replaced Sukarno. How did it begin? In 1962, 63. This was when British colonial power in the region was changing format, decolonising. Malaysia was formed in 1963 with two parts, about 1,000 kilometres between Kuala Lumpur and Kuching in Sarawak. And while both Singapore and Brunei were in the political crux of events in the 1960s, neither Singapore nor Brunei is a part of Malaysia today. The British always had their man in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, Prime Minister, 59 to 1990. Now, in the post-war World War II period, when Lee Kuan Yew studied in Cambridge and back in Singapore in the 1950s, giving his anti-colonial tirades, Lee Kuan Yew was always British, pro-British. I've seen in the British archives in Kew in London a handwritten note along the side of an actual document, official document, stating that Lee Kuan Yew actually received some training with British intelligence. I mentioned this when I was interviewing a British Army intelligence person whose job it was to monitor Lee Kuan Yew with the binoculars and take notes from a safe house. You know. So when Lee was addressing a crowd in the mid-1950s and shouting out, "Down with the British imperialists," and saying harsh things about British rule, calling them colonial dogs, the job of this man that I was interviewing was secretly to monitor Lee Kuan Yew from a hidden location, a safe house. He did this with another person of lower rank, and he told me once, he replied to the second man who asked him, "What should we do when Lee says these terrible things about us?" He replied, "Lee Kuan Yew can say whatever he likes. He works for us." So, nowadays, most of us have forgotten Operation Cold Store, when Lee Kuan Yew arrested 175 people, almost the entire opposition in Singapore, as well as unionists and leftist political figures. Some stayed in prison for 10 years, not being charged with any crime. The last was released in May 1989. February 1963, British Special Branch, that's British intelligence, mounted Operation Cold Store to safeguard against any attempt by the communists to mount violence or disorder, I'm quoting, in the closing stages of the establishment of the Federation of Malaysia. At the head of the list of hardcore communists was this other political figure in Singapore who had the capacity to outshine Lee Kuan Yew. His name was Lim Chin Siong. So that's Lim there. In 1956, to give an example of what happened, there were huge riots in Singapore, which continued for a month. Helicopters dropped tear gas, people were killed. Archival records in Kew, London show these riots were started deliberately by pro-British personnel in order to remove Lim Chin Siong from his position. This allowed Lee Kuan Yew to rise, and finally Coal Store arrested the opposition. One report, I saw that Lim Chin Siong had several advantages over Lee Kuan Yew. He was 10 years younger, brilliant public speaker, spoke Mandarin. He was fluent in English, but he had to learn Mandarin. The British also reported, they actually wrote in this report, Lim Chin Siong was much better looking than Lee Kuan Yew. Operation Coal Store wiped out the opposition in Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew accused them of departing from constitutional methods, jeopardising national defence and Singapore security by joining with groups resorting to violence and bloodshed, as in the Borneo territories. Borneo territories were Brunei, Sarawak and Sabah. Here we have the key to the start of Konfrontasi. The main political figure in the 50s in Borneo was a Brunei man named Azahari. Sheikh A.M. Azahari bin Sheikh Mahmud was a Brunei Malay. In December 1962, he was wrongly accused of starting a revolt in Brunei. Lee Kuan Yew was accused the Singapore opposition of being linked with Azahari, and this was the basis of Coal Store. Now, if my English is too fast, just put up your hand at the back and I'll have any questions as you go through. Because Lee Kuan Yew was close with British intelligence, he'd have known that Brunei rebellion was actually the work of British intelligence to get control of Brunei oil and to retain control of Singapore. And the Brunei revolt was a step towards the start of Konfrontasi. It served the British master plan to form Malaysia because Sarawak did not want to join Malaysia. But when Konfrontasi began, skirmishes along the border with Sarawak, Kalimantan, and the British propaganda really, British claimed that Indonesia wanted to claim North Kalimantan, became news. Sarawak agreed immediately to the presence of British troops. The British were in Sarawak, the people were told, to repulse an Indonesian invasion. So the Brunei revolt was certainly not an insignificant little uprising in a place called Brunei. Let's focus on this Brunei revolt, how it served anti-Indonesian interests of both British and US intelligence. To say that Brunei revolt itself led on to Konfrontasi is really to agree with the British point of view, the British accusation that Indonesia supported the Brunei revolt. This is not the case. This period is remembered as a time when Sukarno was strongly anti-colonial, against the British plan for decolonisation. But my point is, we remember the image, like this image, 64, 65. Ganjang Malaysia. In 63, Sukarno tried to stop Konfrontasi together with President Kennedy. What I'm saying is this history has been claimed by the victors, rewritten, re-imaged, so that the actual start of Konfrontasi somehow has got incorrectly blurred with Sukarno. We've forgotten about the start. We know how it went, but not the start. In reality, this period involved both British and US intelligence. Both were seeking regime change. The difference between them rivalry is too strong a word, was how to replace Sukarno. The British wanted a friendly civilian to replace Sukarno. The Americans were acting against Kennedy, by the way. American intelligence was acting against the president. They wanted a military regime. Both intelligence groups were involved in the actual start of Konfrontasi. Economically, this was a period of what I call economic warfare against Indonesia, and it led to regime change, ousting Sukarno. By 1965, what I said earlier, 70% of the Indonesian economy was being fed into Indonesian army activities. So, the British, Australians, and no doubt many of us here, and certainly everybody in Malaysia, still blame Sukarno for starting Konfrontasi. But history is turned upside down by blaming Sukarno. In 1963, as I said, he desperately tried to stop Konfrontasi. We all know, 64, 65, as I said, as the picture there shows, he was pro-Konfrontasi, but why did he change? What happened? So I'll start by giving you a quotation, a summary of Konfrontasi, the official record from the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. The summary is entitled, The Indonesian Confrontation 1962 to 66. I quote, confrontation or Konfrontasi was a conflict between Indonesia and Malaysia that took place mainly on the island of Borneo. British forces, including Australians, supported Malaysia. At stake was the future of the former British possessions, Sabah and Sarawak, which bordered Indonesian provinces on Borneo, now Kalimantan. You notice they don't mention Brunei. Why not? I quote again. Malaya gained official independence from the British in '57. Malayan Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman and the British wanted North Borneo to join Malaya in a new federation of Malaysia, which was to come into being in 1963. The Tunku and the British wanted North Borneo to join as individual states, Sabah, Sarawak, whatever, not as one unit. This was the cause of the problem that led to Konfrontasi. The British wanted Brunei separate. Oh, where are we? That's right. You're right. Yeah. War Memorial. So, the British wanted Brunei separate, and they got it because they already knew offshore Brunei there was vast oil deposits. A long-time family friend of the Sultan Azahari wanted to form one unit, not separate units, Kalimantan Utara, and he intended this to join Malaysia as one unit. But British intelligence and British oil did not want one unit, did not want North Kalimantan to be part of Malaysia. They wanted exactly the opposite. Really the opposite to what Azahari was trying. So they blamed him for starting the Brunei Rebellion in '62. Azahari was joined, or had joined, in the Indonesian fight for independence 45-49, and the British never forgave him. Of course, he had friends in Indonesia, but the British in the 1950s used these friendships to give the appearance that Azahari was inviting Indonesia to take control of Brunei and North Kalimantan. This anti-Indonesia policy was partly because they disliked Sukarno, partly because they wanted Brunei oil. The Anzac summary reads, Indonesian President Sukarno, however, not only opposed the idea of a greater Malaysia, but also claimed to incorporate North Borneo into Indonesia, as had recently occurred in the case of the former Dutch colonies in West New Guinea. Making North Borneo into a part of Indonesia was never part of Konfrontasi. It served the purpose of both British and American intelligence agencies, or I should say sections in that group, not the whole lot, just sections, to depict Sukarno as the aggressor, when in fact he was not responsible for starting Konfrontasi. After the long struggle against the Dutch in Western New Guinea, which reached a climax in August '62. That's the offshore oil from Brunei. Making North Borneo into a part was never really, never part of the plan of Konfrontasi. So the visit, Kennedy's involvement in West New Guinea in solving that crisis between Netherlands and Indonesia in '62. It occurred after John F. Kennedy had become US President, inaugurated in early 1961. Sukarno visited him in the White House. They got along well together. Jackie Kennedy thought Sukarno was a bit chauvinistic, and he was to a degree, but Kennedy recognized his political talent immediately. Kennedy did not trust the CIA and said to Sukarno, as they were standing in the room in the White House, he suggested they all go to the bedroom because he said it was not bugged by the CIA. So Sukarno, Jackie, JFK sat on the president's bed and discussed politics. No other president in the world was invited into the bedroom like that. One of the Indonesian journalists accompanying Sukarno told me that. You can imagine Sukarno testing the springs on the bed and making some inappropriate comment, probably too. Kennedy secretly asked UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld to solve the dispute between Indonesia and the Netherlands over West New Guinea. But after he was assassinated, September 1961 in the Congo, JFK himself entered the New Guinea dispute. The big arms deal with Moscow was signed just before Kennedy became president. So a Cold War crisis was looming. It was similar to the crisis in Cuba. You know, Moscow, America fighting with a large number of warships and planes were promised to Indonesia to chase out the Dutch. But the problem was the USA really was a NATO ally of the Netherlands, so they had to sort out the alliance with the threat from Moscow. The person who had arranged this to happen, both in Cuba and in Indonesia, Indonesia-Dutch dispute, was Allen Dulles, the Director of Central Intelligence under Kennedy. Dulles was a Republican, Kennedy Democrat, but he helped Kennedy into the presidency. He knew before Kennedy became president that he was expressing anti-colonial views, strong ones. He'd be likely to adopt, and he did adopt, a policy that ended Dutch colonial rule in Western New Guinea. However, Kennedy did not realize that Allen Dulles had another agenda. In relation to Indonesia, he wanted Sukarno out. Allen Dulles described Sukarno as communist, but Richard Nixon, who was vice president under Eisenhower, that's Kennedy's predecessor, had previously met Sukarno and said he was a nationalist, not a communist. After Kennedy met and talked with Sukarno in the White House, he knew Sukarno was a nationalist as well. But neither Sukarno nor Kennedy knew that Netherlands New Guinea contained immense natural resources, the biggest gold deposit ever discovered in the world, the purest oil ever found in the world. Allen Dulles knew about this. This was part of his reason. He had formed a company in 1935 with the Dutch that had found gold in 1936. This just gives you a picture of what New Guinea, if anybody's been over. Has anybody been over to West New Guinea, Irian, Papua? These mountains are 5,000 metres high. They've got glaciers, snow, and that cliff, the dark photograph there, gives you an idea of, to get to the top when this 1936 expedition, they had to climb up that cliff. It took 3 days actually to climb that cliff face. The three men who did it were these three, and that fellow on the right is Jean-Jacques Dozy. He found the gold in 1936. I spoke with him in his house in the Netherlands in the 1980s. Alan Dulles was a top lawyer for Rockefeller Oil Empire, and the Rockefeller brothers wanted West New Guinea out of Dutch hands. Dulles secretly helped Sukarno to do the hard work of removing the Dutch. Millions of dollars went to the Indonesian army to mount a huge anti-colonial campaign. The PKI were doing the same. The PKI was doing the same, but without the dollars under the table. Once the Dutch were out, Dulles was planning to remove Sukarno, replace him with a military regime. If only Sukarno had realised, after arriving in triumph in Jaipur at 1st of May 1963, having ousted the Dutch, that he himself was next on the list. Only 30 months later, things would be different. This was the reality Sukarno faced. Once he'd removed the Dutch, it actually set the clock ticking for his own removal. The head of British intelligence commented that Alan Dulles was the greatest intelligence operator in history, ever. And until we start to take this into consideration, we will not work out what he really did. Dulles had been operating in intelligence since World War I, before Kennedy was born. He wrote a book on the Boer War in South Africa when he was 8 years of age. 8. Dulles had already prepared a political scenario in Indonesia that Kennedy was totally unaware of, and in 1958 had been responsible for providing weapons to the anti-Sukarno side in the Outer Islands Rebellion, the PRRE. Zulkifli Lubis, in charge of intelligence in the rebels in Sumatra, told me when I spoke with him in his house in 1983, the Americans tricked us, he said. So what was actually achieved by Dulles' apparent failure in 1958 when Sukarno and Nasution defeated the Outer Islands Rebellion? It achieved a centralised army command rather than army commands scattered around the islands. This central army command was needed for these three things: viable opposition to PKI, oust the Dutch, and really regime change. PRRI rebellion had stated that the aim was to break away from Jakarta, but this was not what Alan Dulles had in mind. He wanted a central army command. CIA assistance for the PRRE was incorrectly described as a failure. Read chapter 4 in my book, in my JFK book. Moscow was watching as well, and they believed it was a failure, and that would lead up to their giving the arms. So there were two Cold War crises on the desk of Kennedy in his first day in the White House, and both were arranged by Alan Dulles: Indonesia and Cuba. The world knows a lot about Cuba, but it doesn't know much about the other problem. So when Kennedy visited, Sukarno visited Kennedy, I should say, in 1961, Dulles foresaw that Kennedy would agree to Indonesian demands, even though Sukarno was a key figure in the non-aligned nations. As Director of Intelligence, Alan Dulles advised Kennedy not to follow up any settlement of the New Guinea sovereignty crisis by mounting any large-scale US aid program for Indonesia. Dulles' argument in 1961 was used in the Anzac summary that I was reading before. Was Dulles just guessing that Sukarno would become involved in another anti-colonial confrontation after the Dutch? No. He'd taken part, he wasn't guessing. So the Anzac Memorial summary read, the confrontation, I quote, the confrontation was set in motion in December '62 by an attempted coup d'etat in the tiny pro-British Sultanate of Brunei. The Indonesians backed the coup leader, Azahari, and gave military training to his supporters. Although the coup itself was quickly suppressed by the British, armed incursions from the Indonesian side of the border into North Borneo continued, and Indonesian soldiers began to join Azahari's supporters in these incursions. This is not correct. This is pure fiction. The summary, really, the Australian summary in the War Memorial just swallowed British intelligence. To gain control of Brunei in the oil offshore, British oil interests had to find a way to divide Azahari and the Sultan. So this was done by means of the Brunei Rebellion. Azahari did not start the rebellion. When I first started research on Konfrontasi, I visited Mackey, Professor Mackey in Canberra, and his response was, I've done that already, do something else. You know? He thought he'd done it. A big book on Konfrontasi, but he admitted on page 1 he'd never met Azahari. Yeah? So the first thing I did was find out where Azahari lived and stayed with him for 9 weeks with my wife and son during Ramadan, actually it was, during Ramadan 1991. Azahari even had a minor stroke before we arrived, so I used to end up shaving him and taking notes at the same time. So there were 23 people living in the house, and it was quite an interesting 9 weeks. Using the information he gave me, I then went to the archives in London. As well, I used to track down various people. I got from the archives names of various people. People such as this one, Lawrence van der Post. He was head of British intelligence under Lord Louis Mountbatten, in charge of all British forces from India to Australia during the war and after. Van der Post was the godfather of Prince Charles, who's now the new king. I was in the process of arranging an interview with Lord Louis Mountbatten, but he was killed by the IRA before I got to him. My PhD supervisor, by the way, was Bob Herring, who had taken the foresight to get into the library in James Cook Library, the complete records of the OSS, that's the predecessor of the CIA. So if anybody is thinking of doing any research on that, all the records are in the library. One person I came across in the list of names was this one, a fellow called Roy Henry. To my amazement, I found out he was still alive, lived quite close to where I was staying in England, so I arranged to meet him. I recounted this incident in my book. We met in the Royal Commonwealth Society, London, 15th of August 1991, the anniversary of Japanese Emperor's announcement of surrender in World War II. It's a grand old building, 1860s, fans, had ceiling fans going around very, very slowly. And it was so hot, I started to take off my tie. Everybody was well dressed with suits and ties. And I took off my tie, and the next person in the next table loosened their tie, took off their tie, and the next person, all the men started taking off their ties. And Roy Henry looked at me like I'd started a revolt or something, and he said, "You colonials are a bad influence." I handed Roy Henry some information from the archives relating to him, what he'd done, showing really very interesting evidence, and it shocked him so much that he stopped chewing his food, and a bit of meat got caught in his throat, and he was choking, desperately choking. First thing I know, a waiter had rushed past me in the restaurant and slapped him on the back, and a big piece of meat went flying out of his mouth, landed on the floor several meters away. And after that, he began telling me all about his role in the Brunei Rebellion. What he told me was, I found out a person he was referring to later. He didn't tell me the name. He said he had penetrated Azahari's group, but he didn't tell me the name. And I only found out this name a few years, 2 or 3 years ago. But it was Ahmad Zaini. He was second in charge, directly under Azahari. And he with Roy Henry is responsible for starting the Brunei Rebellion. Zaini was the leader of the North Kalimantan Army, TNKU, and he pretended to support Azahari's idea of Kalimantan Utara, but he's really working for Roy Henry. Azahari and Zaidi used to be together under the Japanese occupation in Java, and they fought, Azahari fought and Zaidi fought also with the Indonesians in Indonesian naval intelligence. So they were close mates from the war days, you could say. That's why he trusted him. Azahari and Zaidi fled to Indonesia after the Brunei Revolt. They both went to Indonesia, but Zaidi returned in 1975. Azahari was never allowed to return to Brunei, and he died there in 2002. This inside link with Roy Henry was how British intelligence managed to start the Brunei Rebellion. Roy Henry told me it arranged for Azahari to be blamed, and the political result of this operation caused a split between the Sultan and Azahari. So it allowed the British to get control of the Brunei oil, it allowed Lee Kuan Yew to get control of Singapore, and it also led on to Konfrontasi. British intelligence had done several years' preparation to link Azahari to Indonesia before the Brunei Rebellion occurred. They'd even tried to pretend that Indonesia was training the army, Azahari's army, but that was under the control of Zaidi. When Sukarno found out that what was happening, he blamed Nasution. Indonesia was not training the army. It was Nasution's intelligence man, Colonel, later Brigadier General Magenda, who arranged for the training of Azahari's men, training that never happened. Magenda, I forget. Magenda was a close friend of Subandrio, and they both come from Mara. So Nasution was incorrectly blamed by Sukarno, and may have led to his replacement by Yani in the head of the army. The British accused Sukarno of arranging for persons in the Indonesian army to train some of Azahari's men, but the truth was the exact opposite. Sukarno was informed of what had occurred. He put immediate stop to it. So this link, Magenta link, was really a link linked with BPI, Badan Pusat Intelligence, which is the largest intelligence group in Indonesia. So Malaysia was formed, but not as one unit. It was, like it shows there, one unit. North Kalimantan, it was separate. Brunei was separate, and Sarawak and Sabah were separate. I should mention something more on British preparation, because there were 2 British patrol officers who found evidence of what seemed to them was a plan by Azahari's group to form an army, stage an uprising. These 2 patrol officers were not part of the British intelligence trick. So when they found out what was happening, they notified their bosses. The bosses told them, keep quiet, and they wouldn't keep quiet. They were sent back to London, and they still wouldn't keep quiet, and they threatened to go to the newspapers. And that was a serious mistake, because both of them were killed. It was made to seem like an accident, but it was murder. The stakes were so high that the British intelligence were prepared to do away with 2 British patrol officers to keep the plot secret until it was ready to explode. This same cold-blooded tactics were used by British intelligence in fighting the IRA. At one stage, one of the top men in the IRA counterintelligence was a British agent who reached that position at the cost of other British lives. And to give an example closer to home, the disbandment of the second round of negotiations with GAM, you remember movement in Aceh, was the result of GAM discovering that their lawyer was working for Kopassus. So it's a similar problem. As part of the preparation done before the start of Konfrontasi, it's important to explain how a section of the CIA was involved. With British assistance, 2,000 small arms rifles were landed on the shore of Sarawak by a CIA gunrunner, Frank C. Starr. It was even in the newspapers when the boat ran aground. But Starr was quickly deported and everything was hushed up. MI6 had tried to give these weapons to a group called the Clandestine Communist Organisation, CCO. It was a British made-up a name. It was a Sarawak-based group of young men, mainly Chinese, pro-communist, pushing for Sarawak independence. So when MI6 couldn't give weapons to the CCO, they brought in this man, William Andreas Brown. Well, that's me talking to Saharia, General Saharia. Oops. William Andreas Brown. He was CIA in Singapore. He spoke Chinese fluently, and he managed to give these weapons to the underground group in Sarawak. So when Roy Henry and his contact Zaidi inside Azahari's group managed to start the rebellion in Brunei in December 1962, this underground group in Sarawak, the CCO, armed with CIA weapons, fled into neighbouring Indonesia, and this was how Konfrontasi started. So why did they flee? They fled because when the British troops from Singapore were heading towards Brunei, they didn't go to Brunei, they went to Sarawak. And they said this was a silly mistake, but of course it was deliberate, because it was planned beforehand to chase these people across the border. They were seen from Jakarta, and that's really the start of Konfrontasi. I found this other photograph of another CIA guy working in Kuching. From Jakarta, it seemed as though the colonial British were attempting to suppress a group in Sarawak that was calling for independence. Without careful analysis of what actually was happening, without realising what was being set up, I think mainly Jakarta, mainly through Subandrio, declared opposition to what the British were doing to form Malaysia. So it wasn't the PKI, they joined later. In other words, they were tricked into supporting Konfrontasi. It seemed straightforward, but it was not. The genesis of Konfrontasi, the book that is, that I wrote, gives some strong evidence about this man, Subandrio, supported by the archives, showing that he was closely aligned for a period with British intelligence, because they both wanted to replace Sukarno. Subandrio wanted to be the boss, and the British wanted him. It's not the same, it wasn't the same as Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew was actually working in the British pocket, but Subandrio had aspirations for replacing Sukarno, being a president. This was how Konfrontasi began, with provocation from the British and Jakarta responding. It was thrown into the lap of Indonesia, and it wasn't assessed carefully enough, and that's how it began. You may remember that the Queen of England later, after 65, 66, requested that Subandrio not be executed, or Suharto set on doing it. I think this former link between Spandrio and British, going right back to the 1950s, where he had dinner with the Queen actually, may have led to his death sentence being commuted to life imprisonment. So what I'm saying is Konfrontasi did not just happen. There'd been intricate preparation for several years, and this is how Alan Dulles knew beforehand, and this is how he'd warned JFK beforehand not to follow up with aid for Indonesia. The US, when Kennedy did follow up the aid with Indonesia, promising aid for Sukarno, it was stopped by the US Congress because of this Konfrontasi. US Congress in 1963, persons like Gerald Ford, who was on the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy assassination and later became president, they reacted adversely to this JFK's aid program for Sukarno. US Congress blocked JFK's follow-up aid program, so JFK needed Indonesia on side, so he had to stop confrontation. So did Sukarno. They both realized it was going to be their end game in politics. Kennedy would not have been re-elected if his aid to Indonesia turned out to be a big failure. He would not have been re-elected. So he had to stop Konfrontasi. He had to make a visit to Jakarta, and that's what caused the problem with Alan Dulles wanting to stop him. US Ambassador in Jakarta, Howard Jones, explained to JFK that Sukarno had not started Konfrontasi. Jones knew most of the details, not all of them, but he did know Sukarno wanted to stop Konfrontasi. JFK and Sukarno agreed if JFK could visit Jakarta, together they could stop Konfrontasi. That's what Jones explained. Sukarno could not stop Konfrontasi by himself. He needed the extra presence of JFK to do it. According to Dean Rusk was Kennedy's Secretary of State, retired that is. He wrote to me in personal correspondence, a handwritten letter, when he was retired living in Athens in Georgia. He confirmed that JFK's proposed trip to Jakarta was to be the political avenue for Sukarno and Kennedy to stop confrontation, and they both realised that if it continued there, it would ruin their future political careers. JFK was unaware that confrontation using Sarawak and Brunei had been set alight by joint action by British-US intelligence. So handing over New Guinea to Indonesia was only half of JFK's Indonesia strategy. Economic follow-up was the other half. But it got stopped. US Congress stopped it, so that's why he had to make a trip to Jakarta to get it going again. JFK did not realise how much planning Alan Dulles had done to oust Sukarno, and the trip to Jakarta would have jeopardised many years of planning for regime change. Alan Dulles had first planned to assassinate Sukarno in 1955, and about 7 other attempts followed. They all failed. Kennedy's visit to Jakarta would have succeeded in making Sukarno president for life. So from Dulles' perspective, JFK's visit to Jakarta had to be stopped. JFK once commented that in dealing with Alan Dulles, it was difficult dealing with a legend in intelligence. But he did not realise he was dealing with an evil genius. So I'll stop it there, but I'd like to conclude just by saying what happened to the CCO, that's the group that went across the border, the actual start of Konfrontasi, because at the end of 65, 66, when confrontation finished, when Suharto replaced Sukarno, Suharto's troops turned on this group in Kalimantan and started chasing them back to Sarawak. But when they reached Sarawak, the British were ready for them as well. So they were caught in the middle, and the British and the Suharto's troops basically massacred the group in the middle, the CCO group. The British call this Operation Hammer. It helped to cover up the start of Konfrontasi, as well as eliminate a troublesome group that had been pressing for independence for Sarawak since 1962. So the term Operation Hammer had been used to describe resettlement of Chinese in Sarawak once Konfrontasi had subsided, but the CCO were massacred basically. So there are many aspects of Konfrontasi that need further explanation, but I'll wait for your questions and perhaps draw this to a close. Thank you.
Oke, ini masuk ke sisi kedua dalam diskusi ya. Sedikit pemberitahuan kepada kawan-kawan, mungkin karena jamnya ini akan bertambah ya. Jadi nanti tetap kita akan melakukan sesi seperti apa adanya. Apakah nggak apa-apa buat kawan-kawan? Nggak masalah, jangan panggil Pak ya, kelihatan tua ya. Panggil dia nggak apa-apa. Ya udah, oke. Silakan monggo Pak Pradipto.
Baik, terima kasih. Selamat siang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh semuanya. Thank you Pak Greg for the nice and very good presentation about konfrontasi. Yeah, so very valuable perspective to know about Indonesian history. Ya, ini sebenarnya tema mengenai konfrontasi. Politik konfrontasi adalah satu bagian dari sejarah Indonesia yang saya kira agak sedikit sekali dipahami dengan baik gitu ya. Jadi terutama karena banyak kaitan dengan Perang Dingin dan sejarah Perang Dingin di Indonesia khususnya memang sedikit banyak itu ditabuhkan gitu ya, terutama pada masa era Orde Baru dan bahkan mungkin juga aroma kontroversinya masih berlangsung sampai masa sekarang gitu ya. Jadi, ya kita tahu bahwa khususnya karena kenapa ini menjadi satu tema yang selalu ya dikatakan cukup hot, cukup kontroversial adalah karena terkait dengan intervensi dan terkait dengan bagaimana hegemoni Amerika Serikat ikut membentuk sejarah Indonesia di era-era kinian ya. Jadi khususnya setelah tahun pasca kemerdekaan dan khususnya pada masa munculnya kekuasaan militer dan Orde Baru gitu ya. Jadi sebenarnya ya ini saya tidak mau terlalu panjang lebar juga karena tadi saya hanya sedikit banyak ingin menanggapi dan mengklarifikasi, juga menempatkan studi-studi yang dilakukan seperti yang ditulis oleh Pak Poulgrain dan studi jenisnya itu di dalam konteks sejarah Indonesia kontemporer dan konteks Perang Dingin pada umumnya. Ya, jadi secara garis besar sebenarnya sejarah Perang Dingin itu bisa dikatakan di Indonesia baru sedikit banyak itu dibuka untuk wacana publik gitu ya, kurang lebih setelah tahun 95 dan khususnya pada waktu pasca reformasi. Karena kenapa demikian? Karena baru sekitar tahun 95-an itu dokumen-dokumen yang terkait dengan politik luar negeri Amerika Serikat dan juga hal-hal yang berkaitan dengan di politik terselubung Amerika itu mulai dideklasifikasikan atau mulai dibuka gitu ya. Sehingga kurang lebih sekitar tahun itu mulai banyak muncul kajian-kajian yang membahas mengenai peran Amerika di dalam politik Indonesia gitu. Artinya dalam arti bagaimana politik luar negeri Amerika Serikat itu ikut membelokkan atau berimpak kuat di dalam sejarah politik di Indonesia. Nah, salah satu studi yang saya kira menjadi pionir itu adalah studinya Kehin, ya, George Kehin dan Audrey Kehin, yaitu yang berjudul Subversion as Foreign Policy, ya, yang diterbitkan sekitar tahun 99 atau tahun 97 gitu ya. Itu yang pertamanya itu mengenai keterlibatan Amerika Serikat di dalam merancang pemberontakan PRRI dan juga konflik regional, ya, konflik antara pusat dan daerah pada waktu itu. Nah, dan ini juga saya sedikit banyak akan berbicara tentang ini karena ini juga berkaitan dengan studi saya tentang PSI, Partai Sosialis Indonesia, yang dimana salah satu tokohnya yaitu Sumitro Jayadikusumo juga terlibat di dalam gerakan regional tadi yang sedikit banyak itu memiliki koneksi Amerika Serikat dan negara-negara Barat. Ya, jadi kalau kita kembalikan pada konteks politik perang dingin, jadi sebenarnya apa yang dilakukan oleh Amerika Serikat itu sebenarnya merupakan perpanjangan dari politik Marshall Plan gitu ya. Jadi pembangunan kembali dunia baru gitu ya, atau sebenarnya itu merupakan politik yang dilakukan untuk membangun kembali Eropa yang hancur setelah depresi ekonomi dan Perang Dunia Kedua. Nah, tapi kemudian diperluas untuk juga menghalau pengaruh komunis dan melaksanakan pembangunan di dunia ketiga atau negara-negara pasca kolonial yang baru merdeka untuk sedikit mungkin bisa mengikis, ya, sebanyak mungkin bisa mengikis pengaruh komunisme ataupun blok timur itu di negara-negara underdevelopment gitu ya, negara-negara yang baru berkembang gitu ya. Nah, itu dimulai dengan, jadi di Indonesia itu kalau menurut studi yang dilakukan oleh Bradley Simpson itu jadi itu juga menulis mengenai peran Amerika Serikat di dalam menciptakan negara pembangunan di Indonesia gitu ya. Jadi itu proyek bantuan ekonomi Amerika yang dilakukan dalam rangka perang dingin itu ada dua gelombang. Yang pertama itu tahun 50-an, yaitu yang dilakukan oleh MIT Project dan lain-lain, termasuk Cornell dan sebagainya, kan itu kan juga membuat banyak riset tentang ekonomi dan juga perkembangan masyarakat Indonesia gitu ya pada era pasca kolonial gitu. Nah, termasuk juga studi yang dilakukan oleh Clifford Geertz dan sebagainya juga didanai dari skema itu gitu. Itu tahun 50-an. Nah, kemudian tahun 60-an itu ada yang namanya Kennedy Administration, yang itu sedikit banyak berkaitan dengan konfrontasi ini juga gitu, yang dibahas oleh Pak Greg tadi. Jadi kalau yang tahun 50-an itu implikasinya adalah proyek Sumitro untuk melakukan pertukaran gitu, antara lain ya, pertukaran tenaga ekonom atau teknokrat yang dapat bisa menjadi para expert ya, para ahli perancang pembangunan di tahun-tahun 50-an itu, dan kemudian melahirkan apa yang disebut The Berkeley Mafia, yaitu orang-orang yang para ekonom yang dikirim ke Amerika Serikat ya untuk belajar ekonomi dan kemudian menjadi staf ahli pembangunan di zaman Soeharto awal gitu, dan bahkan era selanjutnya. Nah, kemudian yaitu yang tahun 50-an melahirkan seperti itu, dan tahun 60-an itu ada Kennedy Administration, itu adalah untuk sebenarnya itu adalah sebuah respons dari pemerintah Kennedy untuk mencoba lagi mendekati Soekarno setelah pada waktu itu tahun 50-an akhir kan hubungan antara Amerika Serikat dan Indonesia itu sedikit banyak mengalami keretakan yang parah sebagai akibat dari insiden Permesta ya, peristiwa-peristiwa Permesta yang dimana di situ jelas sekali keterlibatan Amerika Serikat ketika salah satu pilot Amerika itu ditembak di Ambon atau di Indonesia Timur itu ya, jadi namanya Alan Pope. Itu kemudian pada saat itu maka terbukalah politik kotor gitu ya dari Barat itu untuk menjatuhkan Soekarno, jadi seperti itu. Dan akhirnya setelah Eisenhower turun sebagai presiden, maka JFK, jadi John Kennedy itu mencoba untuk menormalisasi atau mendekatkan kembali hubungan Amerika dan Indonesia yang sempat dekat pada waktu revolusi gitu ya, sempat cukup akrab dan kemudian rusak karena insiden-insiden di tahun 50-an akhir, kemudian diperbaiki lagi dengan mencoba Amerika itu menawarkan bantuan ekonomi sekaligus menengahi konflik antara Indonesia dan Belanda di dalam masalah Papua yaitu Irian Barat. Nah, seperti yang dilakukan oleh Pak Greg tadi itu ternyata jadi di dalam prosesnya gitu ya. Jadi kampanye Irian Barat itu kemudian memang berhasil mendekatkan lagi hubungan Amerika untuk sesaat gitu ya. Tapi ternyata sebenarnya itu sedikit banyak disabot gitu ya, diam-diam oleh orang-orang Amerika sendiri gitu ya, karena orang Amerika ya terutama di CIA itu menganggap Soekarno sebagai tokoh yang berbahaya dan harus disingkirkan. Karena itu maka diciptakanlah banyak presiden-presiden baru yang akhirnya menggiring Indonesia untuk berpisah gitu ya dari hubungan dekatnya dengan Amerika dan kemudian melancarkan politik konfrontasi itu. Dan salah satu yang dijadikan medium atau senjata untuk menciptakan keretakan itu adalah masalah Malaysia gitu ya. Dan itu semakin terlihat gitu ya. Itu setelah Kennedy ditembak di Texas itu, yang kemudian pembunuhan Kennedy itu sendiri yang oleh orang Amerika banyak disinyalir banyak keterlibatan CIA di situ juga. Di samping banyak juga tersangka-tersangka lain gitu ya. Nah, di situ kemudian itu benar-benar mengubah politik luar negeri Amerika Serikat di era selanjutnya menjadi lebih menjadi lebih konfrontatif dengan Soekarno gitu. Dan itu mencapai puncaknya pada era menjelang 1965 gitu ya. Nah, karena di situ kemudian Amerika istilahnya lebih kemudian yang tadinya itu antara Soekarno dan Amerika itu sempat ada semacam upaya tidak saja sebenarnya. Kalau kita baca dari bukunya Brad Simpson itu sebenarnya bukan hanya masalah Irian Barat dan juga diplomasi terkait konfrontasi, tapi juga ada seperti perencanaan deklarasi ekonomi di tahun 63 itu juga sebenarnya sedikit banyak merupakan sebuah kompromi antara nasionalisme ekonomi yang cenderung sosialistis dan program-program yang bertumbuh pada ekonomi terpimpin, tapi juga mengadopsi suatu program ekonomi yang bisa dikatakan jalan tengah antara skema Amerika, skema Barat gitu ya, untuk mempercepat pertumbuhan ekonomi Indonesia gitu ya, dan membuka Indonesia bagi modal asing dengan dengan nasionalisme ekonomi yang benar-benar condong pada kiri gitu. Nah, tapi kita lihat bahwa program dekon itu tidak justru menjadi mandek karena adanya konfrontasi, dan kemudian itu memang benar-benar berhenti gitu ya. Maka kemudian inflasi ekonomi Indonesia menjadi semakin parah di tahun-tahun 64, 65 dan akhirnya berkulminasi pada peristiwa G30S dan ya 65, 66 itu. Nah, jadi sebenarnya jadi konfrontasi ini saya sebenarnya tidak, karena saya juga dalam posisi belum membaca sepenuhnya tulisan Pak Greg ya, tapi saya membaca sedikit banyak itu review-review tentang buku beliau gitu ya, yang membahas mengenai dua bukunya, yaitu baik yang tentang konfrontasi ataupun mengenai bayang-bayang intervensi ya, yang membahas sedikit banyak membahas mengenai rivalitas antara Kennedy dan programnya dengan orang-orang CIA, yaitu Dulles bersaudara, Alan Dulles dan John Foster Dulles. Ya, jadi memang sangat berkaitan antara dua sisi itu, dimana konfrontasi itu sendiri sebenarnya merupakan salah satu jalan untuk memuluskan program lama CIA untuk menggulingkan Soekarno yang kemudian itu berhasil dengan ya didukungnya orang-orang militer untuk berkuasa di Indonesia dengan menggunakan preteks ya atau dalih pembasmian komunisme di tahun 65-66 gitu. Ya, jadi sebenarnya buku-buku ini seperti konfrontasi ini sangat bisa dikatakan membuka wawasan baru tentang sejarah Indonesia yang agak digelapkan, bisa dikatakan seperti itu ya, karena selama ini kalau kita bicara tentang konfrontasi, maka mau tidak mau akan masuk ke dalam ranah yang tersembunyi gitu ya, dari sejarah Indonesia, yang dimana di situ militer dan orang-orang di sekitarnya itu bukan kelompok yang innocent gitu ya. Ya, seperti yang digambarkan selama ini di dalam narasi sejarah Orde Baru, yang dimana kita tahu bahwa misalkan pemutaran film 65, film G30 SPKI itu kan selalu digambarkan bahwa tentara itu korban fitnah gitu ya. Dan itu tidak ada seperti Dewan Jenderal dan sebagainya, itu adalah murni fitnah, dan tidak ada dasar kebenarannya bahwa Amerika itu memang memiliki kepentingan di dalam menggerakkan politik Indonesia, dan bahwa Amerika juga memiliki politik atau kepentingan untuk menyingkirkan komunisme dan nasionalisme sayap di Indonesia seperti itu. Dan itu maka akan sedikit banyak kita itu lebih terbuka pandangannya dengan adanya kajian-kajian seperti ini ya, kurang lebih. Ya, mungkin dari saya tidak terlalu banyak ya. Jadi karena saya hanya bisa dikatakan untuk lebih membuka diskusi gitu ya, dan lebih mengklarifikasi apa yang tadi disampaikan oleh Pak Greg. Maka untuk dari saya mungkin saya cukupkan sekian dulu, dan saya buka untuk diskusi dan tanya jawab dengan para audiens, para mahasiswa sekalian. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Saya kembalikan pada.
Oke, sekarang masuk sesi diskusi ya. Saya izin sambil berdiri ya. Makanya ngantuk kalau duduk terus. Oke. Sebelum masuk ke sesi diskusi atau tanya jawab, ada satu pertanyaan dulu buat kawan-kawan di sini ya. Mungkin biasanya kan kalau moderator, tugas moderator itu kan menyimpulkan. Ya, kalau saya menyimpulkan kan saya nggak tahu apakah kawan-kawan betul-betul mendengarkan diskusinya atau tidak. Mungkin ada yang mau menyampaikan, what is confrontation? Silakan. 1-2 orang. Kalau saya sampai 5 menit ada orang, saya tunjuk aja salah satu. Lebih enak dong. Nggak ada yang salah, pokoknya ada yang didengar apa. Tadi kan banyak yang nyatet itu di HP itu. Hebat, semangat kali kawan-kawan. Nah itu, apa itu konfrontasi? Tadi udah lama sekali dibahas sama Pak Greg maupun Pak Pradipto ya. Mulai dari aktor internasional sampai aktor nasional, sampai aktor lokal kayak Azhari. Ini Azhari ya, bukan Azhari Hussein. Jadi beda sama Pembanding. Siapa yang mau jawab kira-kira? Apa itu konfrontasi? Iya. Bobo. Sama siap-siap ya barangkali ada yang nggak tunjuk nanti ya.
Kasih waktu lah.
Ya, ini. Karena gimana mau tanya kalau misalnya jangan-jangan nggak paham kawan-kawan. Orang Jawa itu kan kalau diam ada dua hal, dia tahu dan dia nggak tahu. Saya tanya temennya, itu apa tadi? Oke, ini tantang Pak Greg lagi ya, pertanyaan. Jadi ada hal-hal yang terjadi di konfrontasi itu yang mungkin dalam istilahnya itu adalah kehendak sejarah ya. Terus kadung kelakon ya, sudah terjadi. Kira-kira apakah memungkinkan ada hal lain yang seharusnya terjadi? Semisal apa? Apakah bagaimana kalau JFK tidak terbunuh? Apakah perlu ada terus di wilayah Kalimantan atau yang lainnya? Kira-kira ada yang bisa jawab? Gak apa-apa, jangan malu-malu kawan-kawan. Kuliah di Sospol kok malu. Gak ada yang salah kok pandangan itu. Yang salah tetap pemerintah. Oh ya, silakan. Ya, terima kasih. Ya, nama.
Oke, terima kasih atas kesempatannya. Thank you for Mr. Greg for being here and for the explanation. Sebelum nanya, mau sekalian nanya nanti boleh ya? Maksudnya daripada nunggu gitu. Mungkin konfrontasi tadi mainly kalau dari penjelasan Mr. Greg baru this book and presentation gitu. Penjelasannya what is confrontation gitu. Confrontation is mainly the conflict that happen in Borneo within Malaysia dan Indonesia gitu ya, untuk memperebutkan beberapa wilayah, let's say like Sarawak dan sebagainya. About confrontation, dan tadi juga dicontohkan tentang beberapa gimmick ya, gimmick or beberapa gaya Soekarno menyatakan seperti ganyang Malaysia and everything, that is the point of confrontation. Tapi banyak juga yang disampaikan oleh Mr. Greg confrontation itself gitu. Sebenarnya pertanyaan Mr. Greg tadi juga yang mau saya tanyakan di forum ini juga what if teori Mr. Greg, what if JFK never assassinate, what if Soekarno still remain the president, or everything yang terjadi apabila dia masih maksudnya masih kondisi status quo saat itu, semua agenda dari Allen Dulles it's failed, what happened? Seperti itu yang pertama pertanyaan saya. Kedua, jadi saya nggak menjawab pertanyaan itu ya, karena saya pengen tahu gitu dari Mr. Greg juga. Sama beberapa some of point, especially to Mr. Greg, something that really attract my opinion about the hidden agenda that Allen Dulles tried to tried to do in Indonesia. Overall, I think in the Southeast Asia with the British, because the British is also his ally, please correct me if I'm wrong. So we know that even Singapore, with their strongest president ever, Lee Kuan Yew, even controlled by the British intelligence, and also the Brunei with their monarchy, SEC and everything, and all the money and oil, they're still controlled by foreign intelligence. And also Indonesia, that we know the downfall of Sukarno legacy is start from because I think the CIA is fired up by his statement, by his character, because he's the strongest president in underdevelopment country. So the point of my question is, according to our topic, the discussion, okay, Melawan Nekolim dengan Konfrontasi, how we fight the new colonialism and imperialism with confrontation. So what kind of thing that will happen in today, in this era, about the intelligence? Because we know that how vulnerable our country, especially Indonesia, how vulnerable, kita sangat rentan sama with everything agenda that happen in international, especially about the biggest country. We know that now we are we know we're facing a big potential in war maybe in Ukraine and Russia. So the point is, what will happen? How vulnerable we are, Indonesia, the underdevelopment maybe still from now. Maybe that's the point. So, sorry tadi belum perkenalan di awal. Nama saya Reza M. Saya alumni Universitas Airlangga, Fakultas Sosial dan Politik, dan try to pursue another chance to study abroad. So, Mr. Greg, thank you for your explanation and your. I will praise your explanation about the historical, political, and foreign stance. Thank you.
Nah, bersyukur kalian, tepuk tangan kalian. Akhirnya nggak perlu jawab pertanyaannya. Kita sudah masuk ke dalam sesi tanya jawab. Oke, ada 2 pertanyaan mungkin for the Greg. So you want to answer it directly or should we? Yeah, there are 2 points. The first is what if theory. What if Sukarno is still president? And what if those confrontasi things didn't end like that? And the second was, what kind of thing will happen in this era about the intelligence? Yeah.
Well, regarding the first point, I think had JFK succeeded in reaching Jakarta in early '64 and had the US Congress then proceeded, Konfrontasi stopped, US Congress proceeded, it would not have happened. Indonesia would not have experienced what it did in '65, '66. What really happened then was in '63, '64, '65, Sukarno actually said Kennedy was killed to stop him from coming to Jakarta. Not many people tend to hear Sukarno's words and dismiss them, just saying, oh, that's just Sukarno rhetoric talking again. But when you look at the background, some of what I've explained today, is that right? Of course, right? Yeah. There seems to be a lot of, perhaps a lot more truth in what Sukarno said in his words, was leading to why Kennedy met his fate in Dallas. And it's interesting also, I mentioned Ambassador Jones, Howard Jones, he said the same thing, but he put it in an ambiguous way, saying that the assassin in Dallas stopped Kennedy from making the trip. Yeah, I'm sure it stopped it, but he meant also that's why he took that step to stop it, because he didn't want the trip made. And he wrote that in his book, Indonesia, the Impossible Dream or something. But he put it in a nicely ambiguous way so he could evade any direct accusation. But yeah, in 65, 66 wouldn't have happened had Kennedy proceeded. So the Indonesian history would be quite different. Sukarno would have been elected president, well, would have been president for life, and Kennedy would have been re-elected. But the situation now is a bit different, with focus on Southeast Asia, China, and the impending dispute with the two major powers, US and China. Indonesia seems to be right in the hotspot, really. It's the biggest country in Southeast Asia by a long way, and but it doesn't seem to exert its, not yet anyway, its potential to the extent. I mean, it will be next week with G20 sort of coming to the fore, but it should be doing a bit more. Perhaps people are asking for it to do more with what's happening in Burma, it's rather horrific what's been happening there, but Sukarno's been a little bit reluctant to take the step to intervene. The position of Southeast Asia and Indonesia, I think, is part of the world that's been predicted in the next 20, 30 years to be economically a powerhouse. China spreading. That's obviously going to attract more attention, the same way that Indonesia was attracting the attention in the 1960s of various intelligence agencies. I remember Nasution, I used to go along to chat with General Nasution sometimes in his house, and we were talking about the death of Juanda. When Juanda died, he had a slight problem, but he said the problem with his heart wasn't serious enough to actually have caused the death when it did, And he was saying, well, he went to Hotel Indonesia beforehand, and perhaps he could have been given something to induce sudden heart attack. I said, well, who were the staff who was working? He said, every intelligence agency in the world worked at Hotel Indonesia, he said. So it was like the gathering spot for everybody to mix and meet and whatever plan for the next step. It's a bit like that now. Indonesia seems to be geographically in that same location, with the world spreading towards, well, the geopolitical forces spreading towards Indian Ocean, and Indonesia is right here again. It seems to be the fate, doesn't it? I mean, 300, 400 years ago, it was geographically the fate of Indonesia to be between India and China. Now it's almost repeating itself. Would you like to say something as well?
Tadi pertanyaannya sebenarnya buat Pak Greg ya, tapi saya coba untuk tambahkan sedikit. Ya, jadi untuk Amerika, seperti apa Amerika ini kalau hubungannya dengan Indonesia apabila Kennedy tidak terbunuh? Ya, itu jawabannya hanya bisa ditemukan ketika kita mempelajari sungguh-sungguh apa yang terjadi, apa yang sebenarnya dilakukan oleh Kennedy terhadap Indonesia pada tahun-tahun yang pendek itu, antara 60 sampai 63 itu. Ya, pada waktu itu apa yang dilakukan Sukarno adalah dia mencoba menjadi ketika tahun 61 ada konferensi biograt ya, untuk non-blok pertama itu. Dan sebenarnya kalau saya baca-baca lagi, saya ingat-ingat lagi dari pembacaan saya terhadap buku biografi Soekarno dan yang ya sekitar tahun itu ya. Itu kan Soekarno dalam hal, jadi dia mencoba untuk mengcombine antara politik non-bloknya dengan kepentingan Indonesia untuk merebut Irian Barat. Nah, dalam hal itu sebenarnya terjadi semacam tawar-menawar yang menarik gitu antara Soekarno, Kennedy, dan juga bahkan melibatkan Rusia juga, Nikita Khrushchev gitu. Dan Soekarno paling tidak dia berusaha untuk dalam kaitan dengan kepentingan ia untuk memperjuangkan Irian Barat gitu. Itu bermain di antara dua kekuatan superpower tadi gitu. Jadi dia berdiplomasi dengan Kennedy, dan memang Kennedy berupaya untuk menjadi penengah gitu ya, dan memastikan bahwa Irian Barat dikembalikan pada Indonesia dengan cara damai gitu ya, cara seperti itu. Dan tapi di sisi lain juga waktu itu juga duta-duta dari Indonesia ke Rusia juga dikirim, kalau tidak salah yang menghubungi Rusia itu justru malah Jenderal Nasution kalau tidak salah. Jadi Rusia atau Uni Soviet waktu itu kan juga sedang berselisih dengan Cina ya, dengan Tiongkok gitu, dan ada skisma antara dua komunis itu tadi, dua komunis itu juga dimanfaatkan juga. Jadi di tentara itu kalau dibilang pro Amerika sebenarnya juga tidak terlalu gitu ya. Jadi tentara itu benar-benar dikatakan cukup dimanfaatkan atau saling menunggangi gitu mungkin. Itu baru tahun-tahun 64 65 gitu. Jadi tahun-tahun itu memang tentara masih netral, dan masih mencoba untuk ya main di antara Rusia dan Amerika gitu. Nah, tapi karena Kennedy terbunuh, maka kemudian mau tidak mau akhirnya Soekarno berpaling ke Cina, dan kemudian tentara Indonesia Angkatan Darat lebih dekat ke Amerika Serikat, dan itu kemudian konfrontasi itu sendiri seperti tadi Pak Greg disebut tadi, sebenarnya antara Soekarno dan Kennedy itu ada semacam lobby-lobby untuk mencoba menghentikan konfrontasi itu, tapi kemudian terhenti karena peristiwa terbunuhnya Kennedy, dan akhirnya menjadi bola liar yang tidak akhirnya kemudian Soekarno banting setir ke kiri dan itu ke kanan, dan akhirnya terjadilah peristiwa menjelang 65 yang didahului dengan Indonesia keluar dari PBB dan sebagainya. Seperti itu terjadinya. Jadi kita memang tidak bisa melepaskan sejarah Indonesia dari konteks itu. Jadi di mana Amerika sendiri juga ada semacam pertarungan kepentingan gitu ya antara orang-orang di Amerika sendiri dalam bagaimana cara mereka, orang Amerika, memenangkan hegemoni global dalam rangka perang dingin itu dengan cara seperti apa. Ada yang dengan cara yang lebih peaceful coexistence seperti Kennedy gitu ya. Jadi bagaimana Kennedy, dan sebenarnya antara Kennedy dan Rusia sendiri juga ada semacam pendekatan juga gitu waktu itu. Tapi kemudian karena terbunuh, dan maka kemudian perang dingin sebenarnya bukan hanya tentang Indonesia dan 65, tapi juga tentang bagaimana Asia Tenggara pada umumnya. Kalau Kennedy tidak dulu, mungkin perang Vietnam juga tidak terjadi gitu. Bukan hanya pembantaian 65, mungkin tidak, dan mungkin Soekarno masih berkuasa ya, tapi juga tadi banyak hal yang akan berbeda seperti kemungkinan jalan sejarah akan berbeda ketika ya di Amerika sendiri peristiwa itu telah menciptakan suatu perubahan yang dramatis dalam politik global. Saya kira seperti itu.
Oke, terima kasih Pak Pradipto. Umur mau kan?
No, just only confirmation about the confrontation theme. Maybe if I'm not wrong about that's the topic, maybe I would like to say the preliminary conclusion about that's your topic. Maybe the agent in behind in the confrontations. Because if we see what your presentation, you mentioned about the British intelligence and American intelligence. So if I'm not wrong, you can mention about the intelligence behind in this confrontation, or intelligent to be an actor in this scenario of in this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Both.
Yeah. Yeah, if we talk about the history, we talk about the actor.
Yes,
just only actor. Yeah.
The intelligence operation behind
Yeah.
Konfrontasi. Yeah. Well, I'm saying really they were really the operators. One interesting thing I found about the actual group, when we say sometimes CIA, we can't. Sometimes we say the Americans, but we don't mean all the Americans. Sometimes we say CIA, we don't mean all the CIA. When I'm referring usually to the CIA, it's usually a group of people around Dulles, and because he was what they call Director of Central Intelligence, which meant he ran about 10 agencies, not just the CIA. So he was definitely forming his own group. He had friends going back 30, 40 years who were part of his special group, and they were the friends that were really their careers went ahead. You know, this fellow was an ambassador in 2 different countries. Brown, William Andreas Brown. There was another person involved in the 1958 rebellion, Sterling Cottrell. You know, people when I talked about Ali's failure because deliberate failure in 1958. That is, he provided weapons to Sumatran rebels, but then he made sure they failed. People say, why would he do that? You know, is he crazy? But he wanted central government to take over the rebels that he'd helped to start the rebellion. And it just confuses some people. But Sterling Cottrell was an intelligence man in the US Embassy. And General Nasution told me, Sterling Cottrell rang Nasution 4 times one morning to get Nasution to go up to Pekanbaru to test. He said there were US planes dropping weapons for the rebels. I mean, that's an example of intelligence helping Nasution to defeat the rebels, but the intelligence really was, it gets inside out, doesn't it? You know, people get confused. When we were talking about this in Lippy, some lady there couldn't understand why Dulles would want to help the rebels and make the rebels defeated. But this is intelligence work. In Konfrontasi, as I said, most people in Malaysia, when I went there, everybody believes Sukarno started confrontation. But how many of us here would believe Sukarno started confrontation? Do you think he was responsible? I mean, before today, of course. But most people, most history books accuse Sukarno of starting Konfrontasi, but they don't get the fine print where intelligence really set it up and threw it on his lap. Others ran with it. Subandria ran with it, and Partindo ran with it. PKI later on ran with it. But it wasn't Sukarno. But Sukarno's the one who was blamed. And I remember talking with Rahmawati about what her father did, and it took some convincing as well, which is amazing. But the details show that really Sukarno got involved, he got swept along, and he couldn't stop, but he needed Kennedy to help him stop. He knew it was the wrong way to go, but then he just can't stop. You know, politics is like a big flood, a Bunchira current. It just carries you along. And he got swept up in that. Once he realised Kennedy was gone, out of the way, he basically shook his fist and said, well, they're after me, well, come and get it, you know. And that's why he was so angry with in 64 and 65. I mean, he told, Sukarno told Kennedy, you know, he's got evidence the CIA had been after him for a while, and Kennedy said, I think you're right, you know. No wonder you hate them. But even Kennedy was shocked at some of the revelations that Sukarno told Kennedy. The two of them got along better than you think they did. Eh? Sometimes you read reports from Jackie. I was referring to Jackie's comment saying, oh, Sukarno, he's a bit of a character, you know. But she was the president's wife and a bit more, I don't know, demure or polite or something. Kennedy was a bit more understanding, I think, about other presidents in the world. Eh?
Yeah.
And as I said, Kennedy and Sukarno got along well, and that's why I think Kennedy went out of his way to make sure he needed it. Kennedy certainly needed it, but so did Sukarno, and they made that arrangement to visit it. It would have worked out, and Indonesian history would have been completely different, but it wasn't. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Pak.
Thank you. Oke. Oh, ya udah kelihatan. Ini tadi mau tanya. Kok mau tanya sekarang?
Thank you, Mr. Greg and To for the interesting presentation. My name is Sharif. I'm from History Department, and for me it's always interesting if we are talking about Indonesia's political situation during 60s era, because it was full with the spirit of decolonization in order to reshaping the nation. And my question is, was there any alliance or some kind of teamwork between Indonesia Communist Party (PKI) and Malaya Communist Party atau Partai Komunis Malaya to fight neo-colonialism in Southeast Asia? That's my question. Thank you.
Oke. Nah, kelihatan. Masnya pasti tanya tentang komunis. Yeah.
An interesting point. The main link with Malaysia was Ibrahim Yaakob, whose name who changed his name when he came to Indonesia, but he was a Malay chased out of, this is going back 10 years before the 60s. Remember when I put up that slide on Lawrence van der Post? Lawrence van der Post was British intelligence during the war years and immediately after. And the photograph I put up, he had a medal from the King. The King of England awarded him. You know? Now the reason he was awarded that medal was because the danger of linking up Malaya, this is 1945-46, so it's 10 years early, with the revolution in Indonesia was very great, and Malaya was on the point of joining the revolution. But Lawrence van der Post's intelligence played a trick on the Sultan in Delhi, and he was only a young boy, 16 years old, he'd just taken over from his father, but Lawrence van der Post started a rumour that the Sultan in Delhi, 16-year-old, was going to join the British in Malaya. He didn't want to take part in the Indonesian Revolution. It was just a rumour that he'd made up, I think. Yeah? What happened was, you've heard of the killing of the Kerajaan. In 1946, the 300 or 400 people were killed. The aristocracy, you could call it, the elite around Delhi, around the central Sumatra. And because of that shock of the threat of Malaya wanting to join Indonesia and vice versa, when the Kerajaan were killed, the relatives, they're all uncles and families just across the Malacca Strait, they realised they didn't want anything to do with the Indonesian revolution after that point, and it saved the threat of Malaya joining with Indonesia. And for that reason, Lawrence van der Post, simply by a rumour or whisper, he prevented the threat, and there was a massive reaction in Malaya against joining Indonesia. So that was one example of the two areas joining, but that was 10 years earlier. That was 1945, 46. We're talking about 65. By that time, as a result of that period, in the 45 period, UMNO, who was still really in power, I suppose, or still the threat, they took over and they exerted really strong political influence. So the likelihood of any left-wing, strong left-wing appearing or emerging in Malaya, it went out with the disappearance. Well, Lee Kuan Yew, as I said, put an end to anything in Singapore, and it was pretty well quashed, I think, in Malaya as well. There's always been a tendency towards towards that, to get something done, to get something achieved, rather than carry on with the UMNO principles that have been going on, what, for 50 years or something. And you see what happens. They get so entrenched to get the corruption that's been up in Kuala Lumpur now. It's just outrageous. So fighting against that level of corruption for sort of social benefit, it has to happen sometime. Some sort of social realisation. But corruption at that level is almost unbelievable. But the main point with Malaya and Indonesia joining up, I would say, wasn't so much 65 as 40, 46, 45, 46. And that was one British man, Lawrence van der Post, who went up and whispered. I was communicating with him in England when I was living in England, and he realised, I mentioned those OSS records that are in the James Cook Library, and I was accessing them and asking him questions on the basis of the OSS information. And because I was asking him some pertinent questions, he wrote a book called, in response to my questioning, he wrote a book called The Admiral's Baby, which is a very interesting book because it recounts his intelligence experience just after the end of the Japanese period when he was imprisoned, and the British first came in to Indonesia before the Dutch tried to recolonise. The British were here for 1 year, I think, weren't they? And he was one of the head men. He's got some very interesting observations about Indonesian political figures that are really quite interesting. Called The Admiral's Baby. Just an English expression meaning what you're concerned with. It's not actually a baby. The Admiral's concern, you can say. But the title of the book is The Admiral's Baby. Any other points? I was going to ask you what you know about the Sino-Soviet conflict, but I think it's a bit heavy. Because I mentioned this in this book here that I wrote. Chapter 7 deals with the Kennedy and Dulles, and I mentioned a new point that has never been brought up before in the Kennedy killing. That's the Sino-Soviet conflict and the central role that Indonesia played in at that time. We all know Kissinger and President Nixon went to see Chairman Mao in 1972. But not many of us realise that Nixon's adjutant, commented that whole meeting, that whole Nixon, Kissinger meeting with Mao, that all depended on what Marshall Green did in Indonesia in 1965-66. We said we're really thankful for the help we got from Marshall Green, and half the people in America don't even understand what he meant. But if you know a bit of Indonesian history, you'd know that Marshall Green was the American ambassador here in 1965, you know. And what happened in 65 was not without the involvement of Marshall Green. That was what Kissinger's aide was saying when he said, we're thankful we're making this visit to Chairman Mao in 1972, because what happened in Indonesia, 65, 66, tended to make a bigger split between Moscow and Beijing, and that's why Beijing then needed Kissinger to visit, because they thought Moscow was going to drop bombs on Beijing. That's how worried they were. So that's why they split up the whole Cold War. So that's really in Chapter 7, if you ever get a chance to read it. Otherwise we'll have to put it online and make it obligatory reading for one of your courses. Thank you, anyway, thank you very much for your opportunity, and thank you for coming.
Oke, ini karena sudah out 2 jam, jadi ya gimana? Menarik sih. Cuman mohon maaf kawan-kawan karena sudah 2 jam. Kalau misalnya ada yang mau tanya, mbaknya mau angkat tangan, nah bisa di email ya nanti ya. Karena waktunya untuk pinjam tempatnya ini mau habis. Pak Gek ini enak kalau di email. Jadi bisa berdiskusi langsung dengan beliau dan nanti dapat info-info lebih banyak. Kalaupun mau belajar lebih lanjut tentang kayak Pak Greg berkaitan dengan hubungan Indonesia dan Amerika, itu bisa dicari bukunya Genesis of Konfrontasi atau JFK vs. Elendus. Mungkin kalau kalian bingung gimana Mas belinya untuk buku-buku bahasa Inggris, bisa nanti ke Pegi Plus atau Kinokuniya ya, atau ada juga Books and Beyond atau ya lainnya lah, cari sendiri lah di internet lah, gampang kok. Karena sekarang digital native kan. Udah, ada yang mau tanya satu, yang lainnya udah siap-siap mau balik. Lagi bilang gitu. Khas mahasiswa, nggak apa-apa lah. Ya udah, sekilas, oke. Hari ini mungkin kita disamperin sama Pak Greg Poulgrain untuk diskusi tentang melawan Nekolim dengan konfrontasi. Untuk ini sebetulnya saya mau berterima kasih ke jajaran FIB, tapi ternyata udah pulang semua orangnya. Ya. Jadi saya berterima kasih untuk kawan-kawan yang sudah hadir, terutama dari mahasiswa, dan untuk itu saya mohon maaf bila ada salah kata, dan di sini saya undur diri sebagai moderator. Selamat sore kawan-kawan. Ya, terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Bapak Reza, Bapak Nekolim dan Bapak Pradipto Niwandhono. Kita beri tepuk tangan sekali lagi.